Welcome to Transcending Comics, a podcast dedicated to trans representation in comic books, manga, and webtoons, both on panel and behind the scenes. I'm your host, Tommy, and joining me today is a prolific writer and artist in the world of both webcomics and traditional print comics. They've written for multiple long-running web series, including The City Between, You Are the Chosen One, and Sorcery 101, the latter of which ran for over 10 years and 1,600 pages. Their print comics work includes notable books like Buffy, The High School Years, Misfits of Avalon, and shorts in the ongoing Adventure Time comics. They're also a known werewolf expert and a lover of folklore, going as far as organizing comic anthologies such as Can I Pet Your Werewolf and Cautionary Fables and Fairy Tales. Here to discuss the Kickstarter for the latest print release for The City Between, Murky Water, is today's guest, Kel McDonald. Welcome to the show, Kel.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, by the time this episode goes up, I know the latest Kickstarter is going to be live. I know you've done quite a few of these before, but how are you feeling going into this one?
Oh, I'm a little anxious because Twitter's imploding and social media in general is sort of rocky, so my main ways to promote it are on shaky ground, so we'll see how this one goes.
Yeah, you're not the first creator I've heard mention this, of having follow-up campaigns, that the ongoing implosion of Twitter is really making the fundraising a lot harder, so that's a little nerve-wracking going into my own first campaign Kickstarter, so yeah, sorry to hear that. But I've been doing a lot of reading of The City Between lately. I actually just caught up on the latest page this weekend. One of the things I'm really enjoying about it is it's kind of unique futuristic setting for an urban fantasy story. Can you tell our listeners a bit about the world the comic takes place in and why the futuristic setting?
So, for one, I always like urban fantasy stories. I liked doing the world building side of the supernatural a lot. And while making Sorcery 101, I realized the reason why the mundane parts of their lives weren't interesting me is because that was too close to our world. So kind of when I set out to start The City Between to make the mundane regular world also more engaging, I ended up completely doing not our world in general. Wanted something that's also very clearly not our world, so that way I could have more fun with it. The other thing was, I remember talking to an acquaintance about how they didn't like A Song of Ice and Fire because sexism exists in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. And while I was like, well, that's part of the story and part of the world, so like, it's okay that you don't like that, but it's kind of like important to the story. And they retorted with, well, if you're going to make up your own setting, why do you have to feel the need to repeat or reflect things that are wrong with our world? Like, if you're making everything up from scratch, why not do it completely differently? And so while I disagreed with them on their opinion about Game of Thrones, that sort of sentiment did stick with me. So while going into The City Between, I was like, since I am making everything up, might as well change things the way I would want them to be a little bit more. So it's based on kind of what I find interesting and sort of also a little bit of wish fulfillment, and also based on what I like to draw. I don't like to draw cars, so everyone takes public transit. The other thing was, while watching a lot of supernatural stories, the supernatural is always hidden from the regular world. And one thing in The City Between that I was thinking about is, well, as technology gets more advanced and there are cameras, more places, and more ways to track people's behavior, that would get harder. And so that's kind of background radiation to all The City Between stories, is that it is harder for the supernatural to hide.
I've liked the interesting limitations I've seen you put on this futuristic technology. Like, we'll get a whole 3D projection of a recording of a convenience store from a security camera, but like, instead of just getting the full image perfectly, like, it's still all from one perspective. So like, as you're reinventing technology for this future world, like, how do you usually go about figuring out the limitations of it, or like where, like, making things more advanced than they are now, but making them limited enough that they're not like perfect tools for solving crime?
Well, because I was always thinking about, like, no technology is sort of perfect. So having those limitations is part of what makes it more interesting. So like with the little like 3D replica thing, I was thinking about, well, cameras in general have blind spots. So no matter where they're recording from or how advanced they are, like there's going to be some blind spots. That was sort of the thought process behind it, is at least for that one specifically. And then the other was what I want it's a fine line between like a complete surveillance state and like what is actually something people will tolerate, because like our phones today track fucking everything that we do. So we are kind of getting surveilled, but it's by big tech and it's for capitalism ends rather than like actually spying on people ends. So it's also kind of thinking about that. And also as I read more about different tech companies' reactions to different things, it's an article that struck me recently as slightly funny was Amazon is discontinuing Alexa because the way Alexa spies on people is hard to monetize. Like they're mad that people are using it the way it was advertised in the commercial. Like people just ask Alexa to like play music or what time is it or what's the weather like. And I guess they thought they could use Alexa to get people to buy stuff through Alexa, but that's not working. So they're going to scrap it, is like a thing I was reading recently. So it's just stuff like it's how a technology is developed is going to limit what it can do sort of angle, and kind of pulling at those sort of threads on what I think would be like a logical limitation on it.
So a lot of the stories in The City Between have focused specifically on detectives and police. And I'd like to know how you approach telling a story about law enforcement in today's political climate.
Well, it's only 2 out of 5, because Fame and Misfortune's about a bodyguard, so she's just hired to be there. And so kind of what I'm trying to do is, are you familiar with the series Discworld?
A little bit. I've not read it myself.
So in Discworld, the main character is sort of like the theme that you're going to follow. So all the Discworld stories that star Rincewind are him like traveling to a different place, and you learn about this new location, and then he says some goofy things and then wants to leave. And then the watch books are all closer to mysteries. And then the death books are all about metaphysics. And then the witch books are all about story structure. So it's kind of, while they share the same setting, they have a slightly different feel. And so I kind of want to do that sort of setup where whenever Rebecca of Fame and Misfortune is the main character, it's gonna have to deal with more of the upper crust of society because that's who's hiring her. And then Jeff, who is the main character of Better to Find You With, he has more small town stories. And then he's a nurse, so I kind of want to have empathy be the solution to all of his stories. And then the 2 cops, Maria and Connor, who are also the main characters of Murky Water, I want it to be more noir, but also they're bad people because they're cops. Like, it might not be immediately obvious, but I did have someone comment on Murky Water while it was getting posted on my Patreon. They were like, I keep thinking Connor's the bad guy, but then he's just an asshole. And I was like, yeah, that's basically every story he's going to be in, is maybe he's the bad guy. No, he's just an asshole. So like those ones, I try to keep in mind why they would want to be police officers, but also how that comments on them as individuals. And so it's kind of, some of it is trying to limit the police more in the City Between world. Like they have cameras that are on all the time. And when Connor's first introduced, he's specifically getting reprimanded for interfering with his camera. And it's also Connor is fairly politically aware, so part of the commentary on him as a cop is he is using being a cop for political gain and optics. So there's like a manipulative side to him. And then Maria's uptight and more rule-abiding, and she would be the person who would respond to police corruption with, well, it's a few bad apples, not realizing that, well, the rest of that phrase is a few bad apples spoil the bunch. So she's kind of blinded to the fact that the institutions that she's a part of and support are not always in the right.
I like how their stories, I've found that like they almost seem to be the prime suspects through the story, since we usually don't meet the actual perpetrators till a bit later on.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of a twist on what I usually see in detective stories. And I'm kind of curious if like there are specific noir/detective story tropes that like you specifically try to avoid or subvert with their stories.
So it's usually I'm trying to like follow through on pulling a little thread and following through on that, because so one thing for the City Between world is a lot of supernatural stuff or fantasy stuff has used monsters as minority metaphor. And with the supernatural in the City Between world, to both do that but not at the same time, is I tried to make it rarer than any actual minority that people encounter on a daily basis. So they're not a good metaphor for queer people because there are just significantly less of them. So I tried to look up statistics for different types of rare deformities or medical conditions, because it has to be a thing where someone wouldn't disbelieve that it exists, but they're almost never going to encounter it. So usually when a werewolf character meets a human character for the first time, it's going to be commented on that they are the first werewolf that human has met. So because of that, Connor is the main werewolf that people see, period. Like, he's maybe the only one that they know about. And so that puts him in a unique position that you don't see in a lot of cop stories or noir stories, because he is kind of a celebrity at the same time that he's a cop. So that gives him a different angle than a lot of noir stories. Like, because a lot of noir stories is the detective's a nobody and gets away with undercover stuff because they're a nobody. Connor can never go undercover.
So kind of on that front of how you were designing the various monster groups in this world, I was curious, like, since you're a known lover of werewolves and like they're kind of our most prominent type of monster we see in this book, how did you go about deciding like which traits you would actually use for this one and like how that would play with their human lives? Like, was that hard to narrow down, like, favorite factors of werewolf stories for someone who's taken in as many as you? Or
no, the werewolves in City Between are almost the same as the werewolves in Sorcery 101, so I kind of already figured out what I wanted to do. It was just like, as I said, while making Sorcery 101, I realized, well, that's the fun part, so now I need to make the rest of the world just as fun as the werewolf part. So it's stuff like, I'm a firm believer in werewolves are the proletariat of movie monsters, because their humanity is treated as conditional. Also, they are stronger when there's more of them and they're united together. And they're against vampires who are the 1% and are clearly capitalist assholes. So I really liked werewolves as a metaphor for community. And that's sort of what appealed to me about them.
Having so much experience then, like working with webcomics, I mean, working so long on Sorcery 101, now being a few hundred pages into the City Between, and also having worked in print comics, I'm curious how one goes about like establishing the pacing for a webcomic when you don't have the same set page length that you do with print comics. Like, is that something that you usually determine well ahead of time through outlining?
So I write the whole script at once, because if I don't do that, then the characters will talk and talk forever and the plot won't move forward. And it will kill the pacing. I also don't super worry if it's moving too slow while it gets posted online, because most people are going to read it in one big chunk. So I want to prioritize it coming out in one big chunk over the page-by-page experience. So I think sometimes that, like, makes stuff a little bit harder to follow. Like, the current City Between story that's going up is about a vampire who, in the City Between world, when vampires drink your blood, they get your memories. So newbie vampires are not used to having other people's memories and therefore confuse their victims' memories with their memories. So the current City Between story is about a newbie vampire kind of untangling that. So they're an unreliable narrator, and since the story is in their point of view, it is intentionally confusing at points. And it is probably more confusing because it's coming out a page at a time.
I find the idea of telling a story that, like, plays with perspective as much as the latest chapter does, like, just very intimidating. And, like, I can't say I've read a comic that plays with the unreliable narrator in quite the same way that Shards of Reflection does. So, is there any, like, particular media you're pulling inspiration from in your depiction with this, or, like, any subjects you've been researching to figure out how you want to depict this, like, shared memory with vampires and their victims?
So it's not necessarily a thing like this. So this is where it's like thinking about stuff and then pulling at a thread. And it's sort of like following a metaphor to its logical conclusion. So if a vampire is sucking up people's lives, like, well, what is your life? It is your collection of experiences. So having vampires do that at the same time, it lets the older vampires do stuff that is way more sinister. But it also answers if an older vampire, like, how are they learning new skills, like keeping up with slang and keeping up with younger appearance? And if they're always eating 20-year-olds, then they know whatever is, like, the quote, they wouldn't stand out as much. So it helps them blend in more, at least the older ones. And so part of it was just me pulling at a metaphor and having it answer certain questions that would arise with something that is immortal. How does it keep up to date on stuff? And then it's also, I was thinking about, since they're capitalists, this is a great way to do corporate espionage, if they're ever doing that. And then as far as the style of telling a thing where the perspective is unreliable, there's a lot of movies that I like that are a little bit trippy. Like, I do really like The Black Swan and stuff by that director. He's really good at, like, using the camera to have weird perspective or tricks going on with the character and the viewer's perception of things. And I really wanted to challenge myself, basically, with Shards of Reflection. And I had my Patreon backers vote on, because I had this story and then another story about Rebecca at the same stage of completion. They were both like half of the script was written. And so I asked my Patreon backers a few years ago, would you rather have the Rebecca story first, which would be more straightforward and a character you already know, or do you want this weird one first? And they voted for the one where I was trying to challenge myself. So went with that one and went all in.
As for your other currently Patreon-only books, I did want to touch on You Are the Chosen One. And I've been enjoying how it plays so much with the hero's journey in, like, a number of fun ways, and finding, like, interesting outs to get out of the hero's journey formula and, like, what it means. So, like, I'm curious about your thoughts on that as a story structure. Like, is the way you're tackling the story, like, it means criticizing the hero's journey, or is it just finding fun ways to subvert the tropes that we've seen?
It's picking at it, basically. talking to a friend about, so in a lot of media, when they show that a kid is going to grow up to be an inventor or whatever, or a scientist, they have, as a kid, they take apart the toaster to figure out how the toaster works. And I don't know why it's always a toaster. So I feel like the way I approach stories that I like, when I like a story, I want to take it apart like I'm that kid with the toaster. And there are several sort of Chosen One stories that I have liked, but I always wondered, like, well, what would happen if, like, they failed? Like, does supposedly Destiny have no backup plan? Like, so the idea of you are the Chosen One came from this god just has a backup plan. And there's 23 kids that get the dream telling them they're the Chosen One. And it's also like sort of a metaphor for what gets in the way of people's dreams, because you have in the first chapter, there are 3 kids that like drop out immediately. And those 3 kids are kind of examples of the type of stuff that's going to thwart the other 3 kids. So you have the kid that goes back to sleep and dismisses the whole thing as a dream. So that would be someone who like gives up before they even start and don't really think about it. So obviously they weren't invested in their dream that much. But then there's the kid that's told that they're stupid and their dream is stupid and they need to like shut up and get back to work or whatever is going on in their real life. And like, there are probably a bunch of people that would love to like do something creative or have some passionate pursuit, but for someone has told them that they can't do it or has beaten them down like their whole life. But then on a happier note, there is the kid in that chapter who just has a dream they care about more. So they're pursuing that one. And it's the kid that's training to be a blacksmith. Like they're very excited about getting better at this other craft rather than pursuing whatever destiny or whatever has told them to do.
As far as fantasy stuff goes, I know you're a bit of a Dragon Age fan, and you've mentioned Discworld, so I'd love to hear about like what in the realm of fantasy has currently been holding your interest.
So one of my favorite book series is the October Day series by Seanan McGuire. Which is about a half-fairy detective solving fairy crimes, which is mostly kidnapped children, because fairies always be stealing kids. And I used to like the Dresden Files, but I stopped because they kind of became action books rather than mystery books. And I recently really enjoyed The Goblin Emperor, which is about half goblin, half elf, 4th son of the Elven Emperor, and the opening chapter is him getting told that his 3 older brothers and his dad just died in an airship explosion, and so now he's pulled out of exile and is in charge of everything. And so it's court intrigue, but like the twist is that he's nice rather than everyone being a dick, which is usually how those court intrigue stories go. I did like Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. I was telling a friend that I usually like political intrigue stories in fantasy settings, but only if the fantasy politics like affect the outside world. I was saying whenever vampire politics pop up in a vampire story, that I usually mentally check out and think that they've ruined their story by getting into this. Part of it is because in Vampire the Masquerade, if the Malkavians are in charge versus whatever one of the other vampire clans is in charge, they're still hidden from humanity, so it's not affecting anything which vampire group is in charge. Whereas part of why I liked A Song of Ice and Fire is the Lannisters declaring war against the Tyrells means the Lannisters now have to deal with a famine because the Tyrells grew all their food and they didn't think about that beforehand. So I like it when there's like ripple effects like that. My friend described it as like a pachinko machine where cascading dominoes falling down, basically. I'm trying to think other fantasy stuff.
I love that aspect you were touching on, though, like the secret society actually affecting the outside world. Like, I think I've just seen enough of the hidden outcasts in their politics. Like, I love when we get the, like, okay, but what happens when the world finds out about the monsters? Or like,
yeah.
Like, modern Ninja Turtles comics have, like, everyone knows about mutants now, and there's a bunch of them, and I'm like, that's what's gonna pull me in. Same with, like, modern X-Men doing, like, oh yeah, these people, like, are some of the most powerful people in the world politically now, as well as physically. And, like, that's what I want, since there's any number of countless flavors of, like, the hidden group of super outcasts that are hunted.
So that's also why in City Between, the world knows about werewolves. The idea is that since it's going to get harder for the supernatural to hide, werewolves revealed themselves first, partly as a collective supernatural world's good PR tactic, because werewolves are human most of the time. So if you become a werewolf, you still have to go to your day job and pay your rent and whatnot. So odds are that any werewolf that outs himself publicly is still going to have a lot of human connections. Whereas if vampires came out first, like in True Blood, vampires eat people. So it's harder for them to spin that as a good thing. And also a lot of them are legally dead, so they don't have the day job or the more mundane connections. So City Between's world supernatural setup is werewolves are like the guinea pig for the rest of the supernatural to see how humans will react to it. And then there's stuff like how each werewolf responds to humans knowing about them is different. Rebecca in Fame and Misfortune is kind of disinterested in humans' opinions, and I frequently characterize her as skateboarding away while giving people the finger. Whereas Connor obviously cares a lot about people's opinions, and werewolves have tails in the City Between for listeners who haven't read it. So Rebecca always has her tail out because she doesn't care if people know that she's a werewolf or how they feel about that. Whereas Connor always has his tail tucked in his pants because he wants to seem as human as possible. And I jokingly told a friend that Connor would feel like there shouldn't be kink at Pride. And that makes sense because he's a cop.
Do you imagine there was like a rough transitionary period of like all that subset of emo kids or former emo, now furry kids that get the werewolf tails? Like, now there's a group of people that actually have these, and maybe it's less politically cool to have those out.
Well, so this is where them being such a small group comes into play. I'm writing not the story after Shards of Reflection, but the one that will come after that. And basically, Jeff and Connor talk about furries.
Oh, okay.
Because Jeff thinks that if someone is into that, he will fuck them and oblige. And Connor's opinion is that Jeff is a slut and doesn't respect himself or anyone else. So they have differing opinions on how they should deal with furries.
So werewolves, or not werewolves, so furries kind of take the role of chasers in this world, and now werewolves have to have that discussion. All right, I like that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious, like, I've noticed that there's not really any shortage of vampire apocalypse media out there. Like, I know they can kind of be kind of interchangeable with zombies depending on their depiction, but like, there's plenty of books, movies, and everything about like vampires running the world or swarming, like overtaking humanity. But I don't think I've ever seen that done with werewolves. And I'm curious if you'd have any perspective of why that might be, or what you might think that would look like.
Part of it is because what we think of as a werewolf is a fairly new invention. Werewolves did not get turned by the full moon until the 1940s Wolfman movie. Like, there is one movie before that where moonlight is the trigger, but for the most part, the trigger is a random curse, or it's a magic coat or belt. It is not necessarily tied to the moon in any way. And also, it's usually intentional on the person's part if they are, like, going back and forth a lot. So a lot of what we think of as werewolf stories that are older than the 1940s Wolfman, they don't usually use the term werewolf. It usually is lumped into witches in general. And when it is someone who is turning into a wolf and back, it's like part of a curse, and there's a specific other trigger that kind of metaphorically represents civilization. So for Cautionary Fables and Fairy Tales, I did a comic adaptation of the French folktale Bisclervet, where a guy turns into a wolf at night whenever he takes off his clothes, and he can't change back into a person until he finds his clothes again. Clothing being like the symbol of civilization and what separates humans from animals. And the story of Bisclervet is that his wife, who is unfaithful, hides his clothes so she can have an affair with another man, and he is then stuck as a wolf for a long period of time. And then you have stuff like, there's an Irish legend about St. Patrick cursed the pagans in Ireland to turn into wolves for 7 years, and then they turn back into people for 7 years, and then they turn back into wolves for 7 years. So it would go back and forth 7 years at a time. And the way to cure themselves of this is by converting to Christianity. So again, it's using turning into a wolf to be like a rejection of civilization or something symbolic like that. So because our modern idea of werewolves is fairly new, we haven't had as much time to play with it the way we've had time to play with vampires, because vampires, the modern idea, that started in the 1800s. So people thinking about Dracula and the vampire story and vampires as a metaphor for the upper class nobility, that's been around longer, so people have had time to play with it longer.
Now, I did want to make sure to touch on your licensed comics while I have you on the line. First one that caught my eye was Buffy, the High School Years.
Yep.
And I'm curious how you found yourself working on like an all-ages reworking of Buffy.
So I was working on Misfits of Avalon, which is about magical girls that are jerks. And my editor on Misfits of Avalon at Dark Horse was also the editor on Buffy while Dark Horse had the license. And so basically, Joss Whedon was doing a signing at the San Diego Comic-Con booth, and I asked if I could cut in line because I was a giant Buffy fan. And by telling my editor that, then they're like, all right, well, here's a new Buffy thing. Would you like to write it? So that was kind of just right place at the right time.
Now, was it hard finding ways to make a show that has like that much violence and horror themes?
Well, so they all take place during Buffy season 1. So actually the hardest part was none of the fun stuff about Buffy's in season 1. And also the characters can't develop in the story because then they would develop past their season 1 counterpart. So the challenging part is that it had to basically be filler. Because it does fit in between episodes of season 1.
And was it challenging, like, toning down the level of horror and violence for something acceptable for all ages?
Not really, because at least with Buffy season 1, it's not that violent. The thing is so a lot of the stuff that would get you censored for violence was already in the show. So in Buffy, when Buffy stakes a vampire, they always have their vampire face on to make it clear at a glance that Buffy is not killing a person. And that's why they poof into dust, is so there's no blood or bodies to clean up. So it's a lot of the stuff that would make violence hard to tone down was already in the show and had already been thought about. So any monster that looks human has to be more monstrous before Buffy starts to fight it.
As for your work on Adventure Time, I know you got to work on that with fellow comics podcaster Jay Edidin, and that was when I was especially curious, like, the kind of on a similar vein of, like, one, how did that opportunity come about, and, like, was it difficult to jump right into something that has as much, like, established lore and as much of a sense of humor and tone as...
Well, so those are really short stories, and I drew them, I didn't write them. because I did not think I could write the humor and the tone of the show, but I left that part to Jay. And the way I got the opportunity is, so several of my friends had done covers for like variant covers, and they introduced me to their editor on Adventure Time, and I did a variant cover, and I was waiting to get back notes, and it took a really long time. And so then the editor was like, sorry, my assistant just quit, and so I am doing my job, her job, and looking for her replacement. And I told them I understand, so to take their time on notes. And at the time, I also happened to have a friend from college who was looking for editing gigs. So I then said, can I give your email to my friend that's looking for editing gigs? My friend then got that job. So then, when they needed more Adventure Time people, I had helped lighten the editor's workload and had gone to college with the assistant editors. So that's the thing about networking is really it's just everyone comes up together. So it's not like trying to climb the ladder yourself. You got to help other people up, and it ends up helping you too, even if you're not really thinking about that in the grand scheme of things.
So did you have any input on like what kinds of stories were told in that case? Like, thought it was a pretty great coincidence you got to wind up on a werewolf story.
Well, yeah, we just pitched them. Like, we sent in one sentence pitches that werewolves are mad that they're not in the ivory tower of academia. And then Marceline, so they were like one sentence pitches and they just picked one. So we came up with ideas and sent them in.
Now, I know that you have a fair amount of podcasting history in your past, like between several appearances on War Racket Ajax and even being a host on your own shows. Is podcasting still something you like are actively looking to do?
I really like being on podcasts. I don't want to edit a podcast ever. And that every time one of my podcasts does not happen or continue, it's because of the who's going to edit this question falls apart. So I always want to do more podcasting.
I was having trouble tracking down your old shows. Like, do those still exist anywhere in the ether, or do those tend to come down when the editor goes?
I would have to ask Amanda if Dirty Old Ladies is still up anywhere. The other podcasts, I attempted a podcast called A Series of First Impressions, where me and some friends watched season 1 of different TV shows. And I think that's offline because we didn't feel like paying for hosting to keep it online. Right now, the Iron Circus Geek Show is Thursday nights and is live, and that's all saved on the Iron Circus YouTube. But yeah, the old ones are mostly lost to the ether, I assume, because we don't got money to host them forever. I think I have Series of First Impressions on my computer. I'm just not posting it anywhere.
So, as one of the most accomplished web comic writers and artists that I've talked to so far, one of the things I wanted to get your perspective on was like the modern world of webcomics and specifically how it's been impacted on things like Webtoon and other similar platforms like geared for smartphones that like almost anyone can upload to. And like, say you were starting your career now instead of more than a decade ago, like, how do you think this would shape the way you go about publishing and writing your webcomics?
So I'd probably write them the same way. But my advice to young newbie webcomikers is make your own website. So because Sorcery 101 was already successful while I was still in college, my professors had me do a little presentation on starting a webcomic, even though I was still a student. And I have been invited back a couple of times by old professors to give that same sort of presentation. But the way I've updated it is, here's a list of things that I use to start my webcomic that don't exist anymore. And it's just running down all the different like internet web services that have come and gone since I started doing webcomics. And while it's great that you can put your comic on Webtoon for free, who knows how long that's going to last. So it's like Hark a Vagrant used to be hosted on LiveJournal. Who's on LiveJournal anymore? All those people that their webcomic was posted and distributed via Twitter, they're having a hard time now. So it's just like, it's not don't use these things. It's have a website that isn't dependent on the whims of some tech overlord who could wake up tomorrow and be like, I've decided no more pictures on my website, or I've decided that we're shutting this all down, or charging $50 a month, or whatever. You never know. The internet changes fast. And I probably wouldn't change the way I lay out my pages, because as cool as the infinite scroll webtoon thing is, that's a real pain in the ass to put into a book.
Yeah, I'm currently facing that dilemma myself. Like, I'm working on a webcomic. My artists are putting it in the webtoon format, just since that's like where the vast majority of readers are. But like, that's kind of hanging over me, and just the big learning curve is like, okay, how are we going to convert this into print down the line? I'm hoping that maybe converting it more to manga format will work a little bit better than like traditional comics or full-size graphic novels, just due to the dimensions. And plus, manga sells a lot better, so I'm kind of hoping if I can get it more in that line or catch eyes for manga readers, that'll help with sales someday.
Yeah, my day job is at 7Seas, and they also translate webtoons, and the production designers like can kind of crank out the layouts for the mangas pretty quickly, but whenever they get a webtoon, it's like, well, that's my week of work rather than my day of work. So it's rough.
Now, I'm still a bit of a newcomer to the world of webcomics, and I've now stumbled on a couple series that like will catch my eye, but then I see they've gone on hiatus and just never really come back. And I'm curious if like you have any insight to share with potential webcomic creators on like when you think it's the right time to step away from a series, or if it's like always best just to keep pushing forward till you get to some kind of logical ending.
I don't know. That's up to everybody. Everyone's different. I'm a weirdo because I insist on finishing everything I start. I feel like maybe toward the end, I should have ended Sorcery 101 earlier than I let it go on to. Not because I was like, it was more like crunching the numbers financially. I was maybe losing money by sticking with and finishing Sorcery 101 than if I had moved on to something new. But yeah, Sorcery 101's too long.
Heard it here first, folks. But as kind of a closing question here, I like to tailor one specifically to the interests of each guest. And you being the organizer behind Can I Pet Your Werewolf? I've got to know, what werewolf do you think is most deserving of pets? Or which one do you want to pet most?
Oh, I feel like Scott from MTV's Teen Wolf is like if a golden retriever is a person. If you haven't seen MTV's Teen Wolf, the power of friendship makes you a better werewolf, and the plot of that show is the main character, who's an idiot, is the best at making friends. So he's the best at friendship, so that makes him the best werewolf. And all the villains are trying to find a loophole to be more powerful without friendship, and they just keep losing to friendship. It's like a shonen anime.
I feel like there was a period of VH or MTV and VH1 shows that like they almost seemed like things you would see as a background gag on The Simpsons, like shows like Date My Mom or like the various other like hilarious dating reality shows. But yeah, the Twilight style like modern reimagining of Teen Wolf also seems like something Simpsons or another cartoon would do as a joke. But yeah, I don't think any of us expected it to turn out as good as it did, and so much better than its original incarnation.
Yeah.
But Kel, it's been great having you on the show, and for our listeners that want to support the next volume of The City Between, where can they find you, and where can they find you on Kickstarter?
My website is kelmcdonald.com, because I do have my own website, which every comic creator should have. And you can get Murky Water, the 4th City Between book, kickstarter.com/Murky Water. I think that's going to be the URL. Sometimes they throw in a bunch of numbers in between, but it will be on there, and I'll have it linked on my website and all the social medias I have. There's too many social medias. Right now, I'm mostly on Blue Sky, and then I have an assistant that helps me post on Tumblr and Instagram and Facebook. Twitter is dead to me.
Yeah, every time I get on there, it's a little more dead than the last, and I know it's a good thing, but like, there's not been one unified place to migrate to, and yeah, the social media navigation's only getting harder.
Mm-hmm.
But if the listeners at home have requests or recommendations for comics or creators you'd like us to cover in the future, you can send them our way on social media. You can find us on the Transcending Comics Instagram and Facebook page, on Twitter is @TranscendComics, or email us at transcendingcomics@gmail.com. We'd like to thank you for giving our podcast a chance, and give a shout out to Ray Day Parade for designing our logo. Our intro and outro music this week is A Little Soul and You've Been Starring by Carlson. You can check out more of his music on carlson.com. Join us again next time as we continue transcending boundaries and exploring the colorful world of trans, non-binary, and genderqueer representation in comic books of all kinds. As the curtains fall on this episode of Transcending Comics, remember that comics have the power to inspire change in countless worlds, including our own. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep transcending.